Hi, this is Kurt Doolittle for the Proprietary Institute. This video is about operational prose. If you look at the screen, you'll see we went from vocabulary. Now this is phrases and sentences, and after this is stories and arguments and the grammars. So that means we're about right here in the part one. There are 7 parts. This page goes on forever. There's a lot of stuff to cover. But in the part one of the method, we did the overview. We covered concepts. We did operational terms. And now we're doing operational prose. So what problem are we trying to solve? I don't know. I'm going to have some coffee and see if I'm up for this morning. Now we've taken an overview of the method and seen the whole thing, and then we worked on concepts, which was the constant relations, dimensions, constant relations, and first principles. A couple of others in there like marginal indifference, and so we went through how to do terms. Well, now we're going to take that up to the next level and say how do we apply that same process to exhaustively disambiguating phrases and sentences. How do we operationalize prose? Gotta get in the frame of this. Communication of a transaction for meaning by sequences of phonemes, right, with sounds, in a sequence of words. And that by use of those sequences of phonemes and sequences of words, by the process of incremental suggestion, in other words, we're using these terms to suggest a measurement or an analogy to a measurement, in other words, still a measurement, to the listening party, using a serial stream, in other words, a sequence of words of unambiguous measurements, in continuous recursive disambiguation, mean that every additional amount of information we provides additional disambiguation, thereby obtaining consent or not on consistency and coherence. And then once we have obtained that consent or agreement on meaning, we think of it as recognition or understanding. Then we perform due diligence against error, bias, and deceit. Well, we'd like to. What we really do is we just hope the other person doesn't object, and this is what some of us are more careful about than others. But the point I want to get across here is that when we're speaking, we're using this stream. This stream diminishes ambiguity by creating increases in precision until a contract for meaning is established. And if we're successful, and we think the person understands us, they might ask us more questions, which is due diligence on their part, or we might port us wine, port us something you drink, parts or things. It's morning! Anyway, so on their part, you can perform due diligence on your part. In other words, you can simply say, and by the way, that doesn't include this, that, or the other thing. So that's your due diligence on your part to make sure they understand. So what we're trying to get across is that this is a process of suggestion, incremental suggestion. And it's only when we've used suggestion morally, ethically, and reciprocally that we are communicating truthfully. And it's when we are using suggestion immorally, unethically, and untruthfully that we're engaging in the wrong kind of suggestion. And it's amazing how much we combine these things in ordinary conversation. There are very disciplined speakers in the world, and if you get in the habit of speaking in disciplined prose, lawyers do this, then you are very cautious about what you say. But some of us are just in idiomatic language, and we're speaking lazily because the other person has about the same frame of reference of us as we do, and has about the same frame of value, so we can speak lazily. On the other hand, when we're in matters of disagreement or conflict, or and someone's trying to engage in deceit, this process of suggestion needs to be possible to disambiguate into determining what's going on. So These are the steps of suggestion as a association, right? Where we can conduct suggestion by an association, like a parable or analogy, or simply a set of words that remind. That's what words do, is they remind other people of certain associations. We can do it by identity. In other words, we can say John or your brother John, or we can say those guys over there, or some hypothetical person, or an imaginary ideal person. We can suggest by a process of deduction. Well, if this is the case, then that has to be a case also. We can do it by induction. Well, if you're given these general examples, you must mean this. We can do it by abduction, which is a great word for sort of, yeah, maybe that's sort of right. That's probably what you mean. And we can do it by guessing. In other words, given the sparse information we have, we can guess at what that meaning is. So you see that we've got this spectrum of decreasing precision as we get down to guessing, and then you can go past guessing and into things that are misleading. So we can conflate terms. My favorite. This is our philosophy students tend to be in this sort of camp as or sophomoric arguers. In other words, people who debate often online but are actually not very knowledgeable, competent. They'll try to pretend a term means something else. Well, you said this because that's what that term means. Well, a term means what you define it to mean in the case of the argument you're making. So they conflate things, conflate terms, conflate arguments, conflate principles, conflate values. We can inflate. We can load and frame. We can say, well, this is better. We can add emotional content. We can use gossiping and rallying and shaming and moralizing, and we can inflate by judgments. We can fictionalize, which is we can add storytelling around the thing in order to frame it. And we can fiction. We can fiction by adding stuff around it. We can fictionalize using pseudoscience and sophistry and supernaturalism. We can evade the topic. We can deny whatever you're saying. Those are the people that are deniers. Deniers. I'd almost rather they try to put up an argument than the people who just their method of lying is denial. They can conduct in fraud, which is, of course, when they try to obtain something from you directly, and they can bait into hazard, which is to try to indirectly cause you and to come into harm. So this is very similar to fraud and baiting and hazard are sort of similar to ethics and the inverse of ethics and morality. So when you're unethical, you're generally engaging in some kind of fraud, and when you're immoral, you're engaging in some sort of immorality. And when you're getting to the point where you're evil, you're baiting someone into hazard. In other words, you're constructing a trap for them to fall into that causes an involuntary transfer. So suggestion can happen across the spectrum from incredibly useful, incredibly true, to incredibly evil. The whole spectrum. The question is, what's unambiguous, subjectively testable, and what is the only unambiguous, subjectively testable means of communication that's possible between people? In other words, what's the method by which we ensure that there's none of the evil parts going on, or the bad parts, or the dishonest parts going on? And that's to make sure that these suggestions, these sequences of phonemes and words and phrases that we turn into sentences, adhere to a certain number of rules. These rules are reflections of this hierarchy of human faculties. In other words, this next list is a list of what it's possible for humans to judge. We can only make judgments by these things. We can combine them, but in general, we're talking about the hierarchy of the sense perception of human beings, which means this is an exhaustive method, totally exhaustive method of determining whether a statement is unambiguous, subjectively testable communication. So the first is that it's follows the principle of identity. that the terms are defined and that it's unambiguous. Well, that's what we did in the last section, right? When we dealt with terms, we were trying to create terms that were unambiguous, even if they required that we work very hard to make sure that we understand and the people we're speaking to understand those definitions. And that's called identity. So we thought process of identity. When we're trying to test for identity within a concept, we think of that as identity consistency. And when we're trying to understand consistency between statements, concepts, or terms, we're looking for logical consistency. That's that the relations remain constant between the two, and that no new relations are added, no new relations are added to distract from the consistency or to create artificial consistency or to create the deception of consistency. Then there's operational possibility, which is, so we've got from the identity to it's logical across things to it's operationally possible. In other words, from given first causes, it's possible to form a sequence of operations to bring this into being. This tends to be most of our work is translating into operational possibility. The grammar, in other words, the grammar of organizing sentences tends to do a pretty good job of testing internal consistency. So if we have unambiguous words, we follow good grammar, and we state it in operational prose, as long as point 4, external correspondence results, then we've got a pretty good statement that's saying any set of actions followed the net laws of the universe, was observable or testable, subjectively testable, and intersubjectively testable, and that it's not false. The great thing is, because our human sense perception can then test unambiguity, can test internal consistency, can test operational possibility, and can test by observing external correspondence. That's pretty much the scope of what's necessary to say to something fit within the physical laws of nature. But then we get to the behavioral laws of the universe. There's behavioral laws. The behavioral laws, we think that there's something magic, but the behavioral laws are just extensions of the physical laws. The only difference is we have the ability to remember, either at the DNA level, or the cellular level, DNA level, or at the memory level. We can keep record of something, and so as such we can cheat. We can use a little delay there. We don't have to seize the first opportunity, or we can evade certain costs. So human behavior, animal behavior, is just an extension of the laws of the nature. It follows the same laws of conservation of energy that the rest of the universe does, except we can store energy, release it, we can store memories, and make use of them. So we have the next, after the first 4 physical steps, we have the 2 behavioral steps, which is this a rational choice? In other words, we mean is bounded rationality, not rational like logical. We mean rational like bounded rationality. In other words, am I demonstrating an understandable, imitatable, sympathetic, and empathic set of incentives, and am I following them? Can I understand those as rational? Well, of course you can. All behavior, human behavior, is at some point understandable and rational. Even crazy people, well, you get into the psychosis and then not, but most people, regardless of how silly their actions are, if you can understand the empathize, sympathize, imitate their circumstance, sympathize with their frame of mind, and empathize with their emotions, you should be able to say, oh, I see how you came to that conclusion. Well, so people tend to make rational choices. It's different when we say, yeah, they do. They tend to make rational choices almost always. When we think those choices are irrational, one of 2 things has happened. Somebody's not telling the truth about what happened, or we don't understand, because always human behavior is expressible as a series of rational incentives. Conversely, so is reciprocity. So that means that when you're engaging with the other person has this same rational incentive. And the only time it's rational to cooperate, or to voluntarily transfer assets is when you can imitate, sympathize, and empathize with their conditions, physical conditions, cognitive conditions, and emotional conditions. So when you say that, reciprocity is just rational choice from both parties. So then you get into now we've gone through the physical laws, we've gone through the behavioral laws. I'm going to avoid the evolutionary law right now because it requires too much other knowledge to talk about it. But there are, you can understand what I'm saying about incentives. Following incentives, rational choice. We all have rational incentives. But if I start getting into what it takes to organize a society and polity, this requires some more knowledge of some basic economic concepts. I don't want to avoid them. So there's another set here that are evolutionary laws. And then after that, we say, okay, now how do we say that this is warrantable? Now, how do I tell you with points 6 and 7 here that it's possible to testify this, that I've done my due diligence on it, and that you can hold me accountable. In other words, I can make this as a truth claim. In other words, I can offer a contract of warranty. That's what a truth claim is. And you can hold me that I've warranted, and I will remain liable for it. So in order to make ourselves be sure we have performed due diligence, we have to make sure we've discovered the limits. You saw we just talked about terms. We had thought about what are the extremes. In other words, there's a point at which things are just accidents, not intentions. Okay, that's a limit. We want to make sure we know the upper and lower limits of any series we've stated, and that we fully accounted for all the phenomena inside it. We want to make sure that it's competitively parsimonious. In other words, of the set of available solutions, which one is the most parsimonious? This tends to be a version of Occam's razor, but Occam's razor and the scientific method under Karl Popper, they failed to account for costs, and it just turns out that, this is probably a little deep for this part of our conversation, but it turns out that accounting for costs is also what the natural law, the laws of nature do. So if you account for costs, you can determine competitive parsimony. That's where Karl Popper that was the second place Karl Popper sort of got lost. And then you say, well, is this warranted within the limits of reversibility? In other words, if can I warranty this? In other words, if you take an action upon it, is this open to restitution or reversibility? This is not so important between you and I, except that we'll be blamed for something, and we're blamed under trust. That's one thing, but we could be blamed under tort is another thing, and we could be blamed under crime is another thing, and we could be blamed under treason for another. And what our politicians often do is treasonous. So we need to know that it's liable and reversible. So you just say, well, can I reverse this? And even if I'm wrong, can I compensate for it? So you warranty something? Well, you can't. There's a lot of things you can't warranty. You can warranty it as trust. You can warranty it as tort. You can warranty it as crime. You can warranty it as treason. Sometimes, the only warranty is your head. So we need to know which warranty you're making, and you need to be aware of what warranty you're making. So that's how we operationalize prose at a high level. That's what we're trying to accomplish by operationalizing prose. We're trying to satisfy the ability to reduce something to subjective testability that allows us to avoid the use of language for suggestion to conduct or participate in ignorance, error, bias, deceit, wishful thinking, fraud, treason, and whatever, and war. So, So we're trying to make all that happen. And the third part here is the checklist that you'll see come up over and over again in our work, so that you're trying to say, have I satisfied these particular things? Because if I had, that's the full spectrum of human subjectively testable functions. So what's an operational language? So we saw us go through a list of humanly subjective testable dimensions and what we'd have to warranty. There are also some things we can do to some constraints we can put on phrases and sentences in order to make sure that we're speaking in a vocabulary, grammar, and logic that's testable by those dimensions that humans have that we can test. So our goal or our objective is to produce a grammar, a universally commensurable set of measurements, universally set of phrases that just are combinations of transactions of those measurements, and that's an operational grammar. So we want a fully commensurable system of measurement. We want it to be a deflationary grammar. It's removed from inflation, conflation, whatever. We want it to be in promissory form. Now, this is just a good habit, so it gets us out of God mode. We say, it is, or is different from, that's a God mode speech, like, I am the Lord, and I say that this is, to, I promise you will observe that. That's a statement of me saying something, not an ideal statement. So we put things in promissory form. It's called all truth claims are implied as promises. In other words, you can't say something's true without making a promise that is true. You can say you think it might be true, but if you say it's true, then you're implying that you're making a promise. So we just disambiguate that fact and put the sentence in promissory form. So I promise. We limit ourselves to a single point of view. In other words, you can't testify to another's mind. You can testify to what you understand or believe as another's incentive. So you can testify to your interpretation of a set of incentives, or you can observe what actions the person took, but you can't testify to a person's state of mind. So we ask you to maintain a single point of view, usually either I testify, I promise, or I observe, rather than switching around and narrating from different people's positions. That one doesn't happen too often, but it is good to be aware that people are testifying for others. You find this all the time. It's natural also for mom. Now, you have a young woman, you've got children, you are continually in the practice of mind reading. You have to, because the little ones can't express themselves very well. And so that it's natural to testify on behalf of the child. But once we're adults, you can't testify for. Once you're able to have cognitive agency, then you can't testify for others. The second thing, the hard part is the one that most people have difficulty with is decopulating, not copulating or decopulating, but the copula is the verb to be. The verb to be is the copula. It's is, are, was, were, be, being, etc. And these are words that are like saying stuff. They don't illustrate the state of existence. So what you're trying to do is rephrase your sentence performatively so that you're not using the verb to be. Almost all will cover this, but most sophistry and deceit comes from the use of the word is. If you ask someone, can you say that without the word is? They'll struggle with it, and you'll realize very quickly that that's one of the fundamental problems. Is we use that all the time. It's like saying thing or stuff or I don't know. We want to use complete transactional sentences. In other words, John threw the ball. I promise I saw John pick up a tennis ball and throw it to Jane, who caught it. Right, that's a complete sentence. Or he threw the ball across the yard where it landed on the grass and came to rest. That's a complete sentence. You'd be surprised at just how much work it takes to remove the verb to be in complete sentences and turn it into a complete sentence. In the amount of work that is, because we don't realize how much cheating we do. It's rational, right? We simplify our language into idiomatic language or ordinary grammar because we want our colloquial prose to save ourselves cognitive computation, save ourselves time and effort, and it's natural. But you can usually expand a sentence, and if you can't, you've discovered there's a problem. So expand the sentence. an awful lot of philosophical, ideological, especially libertarian, Marxist, postmodern, all the left stuff is, it makes statements that aren't complete sentences, but if are complete sentences, we're converted to complete sentences, which demonstrate that they're actually just lying by suggestion. The next step is, once you've got these complete transactional sentences, is we've already said convert it to performative, in other words, a series of actions. We need to make sure that all those performative operations are in subjectively testable operations, in other words, status. So we need to make sure that we've taken all those things, taken our operational definitions, used those operational terms where necessary, and restated the sentence in those operational measurements. So what we're doing is we're taking it's sort of about that much and turning it into a financial transaction that you could post in a ledger or journal. Journal. So then we ensure that those sentences that are now in operational terms survive the test that they're constructed from rational incentives, in other words, motives, and for both parties, for all parties. And that we want to make sure that, again, we've listed all consequences of changes in state. So the ball ran to, I love this example, when you inflate the currency, in other words, you add to the money supply, you inflate the amount of the money supply, which over time, if money is neutral, will eventually result in an accumulation of prices. If money is non-neutral, then some of this non-neutrality will dissipate into some prices higher, some places lower, and some prices not unaffected, and some debts now misrepresented, and some investments now depreciated. So that's going through all the consequences. There's more, but I mean, I'm trying to use that example that example is that, have you thought about all the consequences? In economics, we call this externalities. So if I said John threw the ball at the dog, but John threw the ball. John told the dog to catch the ball, threw the ball. John missed the dog, hit the window, broke the window. Well, that's great. But because he broke the window, what happened? Those are the externalities to it. I'm using the broken window analogy because if you read economics in one lesson, that's the basis of the full accounting in economics. Economics is, you account for the seen and unseen. You account for not only what did happen, but what didn't happen because that happened instead. So you account for the seen and unseen, and the real cost is the difference between the seen and unseen. Well, that's what we're trying to do here, is we're trying to illustrate that you need to account for not only what occurred fully, but account for the externalities. That's a complete set of consequences. And then for clarification, you can see me doing this everywhere, use parenthetic prose. As you see in this list, I'm saying absent the verb to be, and then I list them. I list them in parentheses, that's parenthetic, and then I enumerate them, so I cover the list. So parenthetic and enumerated. And so what I'm telling you that we can do is we can speak in parenthetic and enumerative prose in order to clarify what might be not understood or ambiguous or could require different information. The algorithmic prose we'll get to later, but as you see how I wrote this paragraph, as I wrote it as a programming set of testable steps in a programming language. Fully commensurable in deflationary form and promissory form limited to, that's algorithmic prose. And if we can write functions too, which go off and call other things, so we can do functional prose. We don't have to get into that right now, but the idea is that we're applying the same structured logic that we see in programming to the construction of sentences, and that's why this is very close to programming. And this should result in a series of phrases and sentences that result in transactions which are testifiable because they're subjectively testable by the human faculties we possess. Whew. Okay. Well, great. Now that I've told you what we're doing and beat a dead horse, and I've already taken 40 minutes, let's talk about how you deflate and operationalize it. There's really, hopefully we can get through this without too much suffering. So the necessary steps are, once again, decopula, operational vocabulary, promissory form, fully complete sentences, fully accounted sentences and arguments, and we add the clarifying steps of parenthetic, enumerative, and algorithmic prose. That's how you do it. That's the method, right? And so I put that method into this form, which is the operational description. First, write your sentences just like you intuit them. So if you hear something or you want to say something, write it down. Collect all the terms. Go find your terms or define terms as necessary to make sure you're using unambiguous terms that have operational definitions. Eliminate the verb to be, the copula. Start with I promise, and then convert to operational vocabulary for using the terms you just researched, and then convert to complete and full sentences, and then add parenthetic and enumerative and algorithmic prose if you need to clarify. This sounds great, but it's actually quite difficult because we have to train ourselves to test. We're overly confident, and we have to be. We need to survive. We need to act to survive. We need to have confidence to survive, and so we've got a lot of cognitive biases that make us pursue action in order to survive, despite the fact that we may not know what we're doing or be very good at whatever it is we're doing. So we need confidence, and a lot of our cognitive biases evolved to give us confidence to act. Unfortunately, what we're really doing here is we're eliminating our confidence by testing to see if we actually know what we're talking about. I found that this is the process I use to do my work. I just do this over and over again, and I do test everything from 1,000 ways until I'm working with first principles, and I can't make it any more reductive, and that's it. Now, it takes sometimes work. You'll see me draft an argument 10, 20, 30 times, and then I'll write it down in sort of an algorithmic prose or a set of first principles, and over the next year I'll still refine it. So it's a little bit like writing simple things is one thing, but writing very complex things or using it as a research method, it's like math. You're just doing it with words, and you're making measurements out of words, phrases, and human perceptions rather than just using mathematical dimensions. In truth, you could convert this to some sort of mathematics. It would just lose all its value because it wouldn't be readily comprehensible to people. So we're at the optimum balance here. So when we say something needs to be performative, we say, we go from, it's a cat God mode to I see a cat to promissory mode, I promise I see a cat. So we changed it from proclamation, an edict, to testimony. It's an operational transformation. In philosophical terms, we moved it from the ideal to the real. I think you can read that there if you want to pause it. I don't think I want to go into that right now because I've already gone into so much detail on the method already. And again, I can say the cat is black. I see a black cat. I promise I can see a black cat. This overcomes the human tendency to pretend we're unaccountable. In other words, to say things. We try to get away all the time with proclaiming a truth when we're just saying, I want. And so this gets you out of the ability to say, I want, and proclaim it's a truth when it's just an I want. So that's what we're trying to do. It overcomes idealism, and it overcomes a God mode speech. The copula takes a little understanding. I mean, if I just tell you, just don't use it. It's that's probably the best. You actually, this whole book's written where they don't use it, so the author doesn't use it, so it's possible not to. But really, there's basically a green, yellow, red, go, caution, stop method of category of using the copula. So when you call it an action, so you can say, I'm claiming that an action is happening, I'm claiming that something exists as, and I'm claiming that something is and has identity or membership, right? So those are three scales: action, existence, equivalency. And so where you get to the problem is equivalency. So we're going to start out with we don't have a word in English for currently performing an action. We have John is digging a hole, right? Doesn't matter. John is digging a hole, meaning he's digging a hole like over some time. He's digging a hole right now. Where's John? He's digging a hole. Well, we've deduced that he's doing it right now from where is John, right? You mean, where is John right now? Well, where is he right now is now, right? Where he's digging a hole. But independently, John is digging a hole doesn't tell you if he's doing it right now, has been doing it for the past 3 years, and he's not done yet. It doesn't tell you that. So we don't have a term for right now. So it's implied. So we can use the term is for in order to apply the it's happening right now. We can also that means we can use is to say John is performing an action. Being in a location, existing in a location, having your body in a location is as an action. So if you're saying I'm doing this or I'm in a location, both of which are doing something, then that's a permissible use of the copula. Almost always you can still get rid of it, but in order to be precise and not overstate my case, I'm going to put these in here. This in here is a gradation. And so the second is existence, and sort of there is a cat versus I see a cat. So you are claiming that there is a cat is a matter of existence. There exists a cat instead of the performative I see a cat. And what we want you to do is convert it to the performative. The same thing with predication. So you want to say the cat is furry versus the cat appears or feels or sounds furry. No, the cat appears or feels furry. That's a performative statement. So you can leave a performing performing is in place. We would prefer that you converted a statement of existence to the performative, and we should always avoid at all possible the problem of inclusion or identity if you're saying something belongs to a category. The cat is Garfield. It should be turned to the performative is I named the cat Garfield, or we call the cat Garfield. That's a performative action. So we're trying to get all of these things into performative, like the first, an action. We're trying to go from an action that is described as performative to an existence converted to performative form to an identity performed to a performative form. So the problem is that most attempts to deceive are using this equivalency of identity, class membership, and inclusion to try to use for conflationary purposes. It allows you to claim two or more things, share properties that they don't, or share properties for the purpose of deduction, induction, abduction, guesswork, inference, suggestion, deceit, for whatever purpose. So you can either get in the habit of avoiding using is, or in the habit of knowing how to practice getting the verb to be out of a sentence and into performative case, just as a method of falsifying it. So what I usually do is can you say that without the verb to be? It's just, they can't, right? And so that's usually the action you get them into, because you're saying, well, you're implying that there's a causal relation. Understanding that the copula does that and getting good at it is really it seems like you solve half of dishonest arguments or conversations with this one topic, because really it's how most things are used for inflationary purposes. So I think I've covered this. I think I covered this already, but we invent language to be lazy on purpose. It's not on purpose. It's natural. So we want to overcome. It's a costly to short-term memory. You'll learn quickly that speaking in performative prose takes more cognition. It takes a more burdensome time. You'll notice also that simpler people speak in shorter sentences, and smarter people at least can speak in longer sentences or even longer stories. Whereas I know Chomsky is smarter than I am, is that his arc of narrative is so long. I won't get into what dishonesty he's engaging in most of the time, but his arc of narrative is incredible, and very few people are able to do that. And so I appreciate that kind of skill. I appreciate the number of steps some mathematicians are able to maintain in working memory. I don't seem to be able to do that as well as the best mathematicians. Not interested either, but I don't seem to be able to do it. I tend to work in long chains of reasoning, and I find that that's very hard for other people too. So it's rational that we would want to simplify into functions. Really, that's what we're doing. By using loose words, we're using a loose function of association to perform the work of suggestion instead of actually enumerating or illustrating that we actually understand what we're saying. So we want to just save time. We always want to avoid accountability. We want to inflate a promise, a pretense. We want to obscure our ignorance. That happens all the time. That's okay. It's forgivable. We want to suggest relations that aren't present or are insufficient for fulfillment of that promise. We want to suggest relations that aren't present because of our own ignorance, error, bias, wishful thinking, or deceit. Or we want to suggest relations that are not present for this purpose of deception, fraud, or baiting into hazard or war. So we use it because of convenience, ignorance, error, coercion, or deceit. So it's there. We just have to. So it's one of the hard problems of language. Is it's so efficient we develop it into normative speech, which is suggestive, which then people use to further ignorance, error, bias, and deceit. So. It's rational that we do it, but it's still, you need to understand how to disambiguate by removing the copula, turning it into performative prose, so we can illustrate that whether it's by subjective testing that it's true or not. So this is why I'm an anti-philosophy philosopher, is that any statement in philosophy making use of the copula is likely a sophistry. Remove the copula from philosophical statements, especially ones that claim they're profound, it just demonstrates their bad grammar and sophistry. That's all they are. It's, if you learn the proprietarian grammar, which is the formal grammar of operational language, which is suggestively testable, which is the complete sentences if we spoke unlazily, then you'll say that, well, these things are just the use of bad grammar to trick the ignorant. And then we get into fully accounted, the next step, which is, the cat is black. I see a black cat. I promise I see a black cat. I promise to see a black cat, and if you look at this same cat, you will agree you also see a black cat. Now, I use this simple and absurd statement to show what's implied in the full transaction for meaning. The cat's black. Well, what I really mean is that long sentence. It's all implied. Well, but if we learn that seeing a black cat is a simple statement, but many statements, especially when we get into more abstract concepts, are really constructed of deceits. So we change from inferred consequences to stated consequences, and this produces a sentence that serves as a complete transaction with nothing implied or assumed, and such. We've eliminated the ambiguity, unaccountability, and pretense of knowledge and understanding that people universally make use of. And no, you don't get to humiliate the mouth breathers. You just have to understand that we have to produce law. So then we want to work in complete transactional sentences. I think I've beaten this down pretty clear. You want to get to the people ever desirous of A, take actions B upon these contexts C to produce D, changes in state, thereby attempting to possess E, including externalities F, which we judge as objectively moral. Blah, 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 thereby achieving these ends. So you want to be able to put things in these series of transactional sentences that produce an accounting transaction. You'll see I use this all the time. Again, the parenthetic, I promise, meaning I testify, I see a black cat, a domesticated cat, and if you look, observe with your vision at the same cat, the one I currently point toward, you will agree, consent, you also see a black fur cat domesticated. It doesn't matter here, but it matters a lot. I mean, it matters a lot that you can disambiguate a sentence in this with this and test it, but it matters more that when we get into claims in the comments like economic, financial, commercial, technological, scientific, academic policy statements, that these things are fully expanded because that's how they should read. Just as, I've left this paragraph here, but it's an example of adversarialism, is that by using the parenthetic method, you can use two paradigms. You can state the simple paradigm and use the sophisticated paradigm. This makes it both readable and limited by the more sophisticated paradigm. So essentially, you're using a competition between two paradigms, one directly stated, one parenthetic, to limit the opposition party from making the audience from making errors of inference, deduction, etc. Where did I go? I thought I was almost done. And again, we've talked about enumerative. We just that just means using a series of statements. So it tends to be very wordy, but it's incredibly useful for eliminating disambiguation because people will try to expand the scope of the members of any set unless you specifically state them, unless you state them in an order, a disambiguated order of common relations, so consistent relations, so that it's obvious when they've tried to insert something that doesn't belong. So I've given an example here that I won't cover now, but I go reciprocity, display word indeed is a common enumeration I use all the time. Producing market adversarialism that maximizes the rate of adaptability, etc. So these are enumerative sentences that list all the properties of a thing, like universally commensurable, value neutral, formal, logic of natural law, and then I go through and enumerate language, psychology, sociology, law, politics, etc. So that's using the enumerative method. Again, this is to lay down in stone the inability for others to intentionally or accidentally misinterpret or abuse what you've said, or for us to disambiguate and identify the abuses that others have cast upon us. And yeah, it's pretty, language is pretty weak because it's serial, but it tends to work. We tend to be very good at it. So it's burdensome on working memory. It's more burdensome to construct, but it makes you consider all the factors, makes you complete the definition in a transaction, and makes you completely defend your ideas or your laws. What have I done here? Have I gone through this? Yeah. I thought I would be done by now. Next, there are no paradoxes. So I should have put this by philosophy. There's just bad grammars and lies. Everything written in this box is false is just a deception because it makes use of the grammar of continuous recursive disambiguation without contributing more information to the act of recursion, the back reference. So it basically creates a logical loop. So no, you can't. Words don't mean things, people mean things. The person who constructed this was constructing a deception by means of taking advantage of our ignorance of grammar and the rules of grammar that language is dependent upon. So why use an operational grammar? Operational grammar produces sentences that consist of transactions together producing an accounting of changes in state that, if cannot be constructed, cannot constitute a truth claim, and as such can produce a defense against falsehood, error, and deceit. So the operational grammar is our test of eliminating falsehood, false claims. So again, I'm just reiterating that our methodology consists of disambiguation of sentences by deflation, defictionalization, decopulization, operationalism, and expanded sentences, complete sentences that are parenthetic and enumerative, producing a vocabulary and grammar of constant relations between reality, our faculties, and our display, word and deed, resulting in a system of measurement, producing commensurability regardless of subject matter. And that's covering the operational prose. I took an hour for this. I thought I could do it in 40 minutes, so I'm going to trim some of this. Anyway, I hope you followed that. I think I did a sufficiently thorough job of beating the dead horse until it's done. So thank you for following so far. I hope you're getting value out of it and beginning to see how terms and operational prose produce a system of measurement. And hopefully you'll join us for the next. I'm Kurt Doolittle for the Propertarian Institute. Thank you.